Good evening and welcome to 15 Minutes with Longevity. My name is Gisele Wertheim Aymes and I'll be hosting you this evening. Tonight we're speaking to Marc Kahn. He's Head of Human Resources and Organisation Development for Investec, as well as a registered clinical psychologist with the Health Professions Council of South Africa. That makes him quite unique actually. I told him that earlier on. I haven't met yet a person in HR in a major corporate who has had actual experience. And this evening we're going to be talking about mental illnesses, more specifically mental illness in the workplace, how to cope with this in a healthy manner. So Marc, as I said, I'm quite intrigued by the fact that you've actually been in clinical practice and you now work for a large organisation.
That's right.
So when we talk about mental illness, I mean, there's such a stigma. I mean, I've seen it in my work experience, that there's such a stigma attached to mental illness. What is it? When we talk about someone being mental and we throw these glib terms around.
Yes, I mean, if you think about illness overall, I would say physical and mental. For some reason, over the centuries, it's not new. The idea that someone is physically unable in some way, people are comfortable with. But the idea that someone's mind isn't right has an association to something quite dark, something unpleasant, something unacceptable socially. And we also subscribe to an ideology that says it's okay to be physically weak, but it's not okay to be mentally weak. And of course, the mind and the body are not two separate things. It's actually one thing. And usually, all human beings at some point in their life will have both mental and physical illnesses. 1 in 4 people at any one time in the workplace suffers from a mental illness. It's around us all the time, but we don't see it.
And those mental illnesses can range in severity, obviously. So what are the most common ones that we see?
So the most common of all are anxiety disorders. And funny enough, it's the one area where most people will admit to it. They'll say, well, I'm quite anxious about speaking in front of a group of people. And if I do, I get quite panicked and I perspire and I lose my train of thought and I can't cope with that. And largely they'll admit to that. Not everyone, but quite a few. So that's your most common, your social anxieties, a little bit of panic. That's on the one end of the continuum. And then it stretches through to your depressive disorders, which are problems with your mood. So people who are obviously in a deep state of sadness around something and they can't get out of it, right through to psychotic disorders. We tend not to see too many psychotic disorders, but occasionally it happens. I mean, very recently at work, in our organisation, we dealt with someone who had a psychotic break in the office. It happens in almost every organisation. Every year or two, someone will go mad, in inverted commas. The madness diagnosis. But more often than not, the anxieties and the depressions are prevalent, and most people hide them.
Are they, do we all have a disposition to them? Are they genetic? Are they caused by the environment? So what would trigger even the mild, because again, obviously depending on what you have. So if you have schizophrenia, that's very different again to, I would say, having, a mild anxiety disorder.
Right.
But how do we know? So what triggers it and how do we know we actually might have it?
So it's exactly the same as physically. You as an individual would be predisposed genetically and based on the environment and your experiences to a heart condition. So for example, if you come from a history of a heart condition, you might develop a heart condition irrespective of your eating habits. But even if you don't come from a history of a heart condition, if you eat very badly and you don't look after your cholesterol, you might develop a heart condition. It's the same with a mental illness. There are genetic predispositions which come through the DNA from your family, but at the same time, even if there aren't, you may go through some traumatic experiences at various times in your life which put you into a weakened state of mind, and then it's not resolved. It might become chronic or it's resolved. So that, again, the mind and the body follow the same trajectory. But somehow we just don't think about it that way. As an individual, if you reflect on your life, you can think about times where you've been mentally in quite a bad state. There's usually a precipitating factor, why now? But there's usually also a predisposing factor, which is what kind of warmed the environment to that coming out. And it's the same.
Yeah. Do men and women show it differently?
Yes.
And are they more susceptible either or?
Yes, they do. There are gender variabilities. I mean, one of the most common ones we see in the workplace is postpartum depression. So we'll have women who then go on maternity leave, have their baby, and develop a postpartum depression, and then need to return to work and are in a very vulnerable state. Obviously, men, that's a big difference, don't go through that. Women tend to respond more to social pressures and develop mental illness through social pressures. Men tend to respond more to financial pressures. Now, if we look at suicide, which comes from a mental illness of one kind or another, men more often than not are committing suicide around losing their jobs or losing their money, and women are more often than not committing suicide through the breakdown of a relationship or a loss of a relationship in some way. I mean, statistically speaking. So you do get that variation, and there are others.
Yeah. Why do we have this this feeling that people don't want to disclose that they may have some form of a mental illness? Is it our society? Is it company, industry? Why do you think that is?
So I think we need to be specific to cultures. It's very much a Western cultural idea. So, for example, if you looked at more indigenous cultures, certain forms of mental illness are more acceptable. Now, we see this now in the coming together of various cultures within the African environment. So take South Africa, for example. We would have someone who is experiencing certain anxiety symptoms at work with some psychotic symptoms, but they're an African person and they have been told by a traditional healer that they are following a calling to become a traditional healer called Twasa. But here they are working in a corporate, in a suit, in a Western context, and people say, look, you are suffering from a schizophrenia, you need to go to a hospital. So we do have this cultural interface where some things are dealt with in certain environments in a more normalized way and accepted, but in the Western culture, almost all of mental illness is tabooed and seen as unacceptable and weak. So it has to do with our underlying assumptions about what's okay and what's not okay, which is very unfortunate. Sure. In some ways, we have something to learn from traditional cultures.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. If you have a mental illness, what are your rights in the workplace? I mean, do you have rights?
Absolutely. I mean, mental illness and physical illness are dealt with under the same labour law.
And sorry, I wanted to ask you, should you disclose it? That was the other question.
Okay, let's deal with them both. So firstly, in terms of the South African law, I'm not so familiar with other countries, but in terms of South African law, you are protected. Whether it's a mental or a physical medical condition, no employer has a right to prejudice you based on that, and you are not required to disclose it. That is private information. And if an employer insists on you disclosing your medical condition, they are in contravention of the country's labour law. That's first. But there is a sort of caveat to that, which is there's a blanket principle in law about misrepresentation, which is not about mental illness specifically, but if you suggest that you can do certain work and actually you can't because either you have a physical or mental illness which inhibits you from doing it, and you suggest to the employer, look, I can do that, when you know that you can't, and a doctor has said to you, you can't do that kind of work, you're not well, that's a form of misrepresentation, and the employer can then say you're in breach of your contract because the labour contract between us says you said you could do it, but you can't, irrespective of what the cause is. So there is a sort of balancer to that.
And in your experience, is it better to disclose it?
Well, I think one has to be, should we call it, sensitive to the environment. Some working environments are more accepting of people and others are not. And you need to look at the organizational culture that you're in. So perhaps in a more creative environment, like an ad agency's creative team or a theatre group, they might be far more receptive to people sharing that they're going through depressive or anxiety conditions at any one time. Whereas in, say, a risk officer in a bank, the risk department might be a lot more sensitive to people going through mental illness because of a concern around their discretion and judgment around very high levels of cognition that are required and to stay very balanced in order to determine credit or something like that.
Sure.
So one has to use one's adult discretion to disclose, but feel safe that one is not required to if one feels uncomfortable.
And one is assuming that person is treating their condition or is under some sort of treatment for it. What of the people who aren't treating their condition?
Right.
perhaps for denial or they don't like the treatment and not disclosing it, and then there are performance-related issues.
Right.
And then that comes up in the performance-related issues. They come to someone like HR and say, well, I actually have this condition. How then does the company's position on that? Because that's a lot more trickier, because surely there's the confidentiality aspect, but there's also the responsibility aspect there.
I think that's a very good question. It's where the rubber hits the road around performance. So when performance drops, someone may say, look, I can't do this work in the way I used to, and it's because I'm suffering from a medical condition. Whether it's a mental illness as a medical condition or a physical illness, it's the same process. If they've put forward that that's the reason for their lackluster performance, they then are entitled to an assessment, and most companies will have a medical boarding procedure for any illness through their insurer, which says, look, if this person develops a condition that prohibits them from performing, they go through a process where they are assessed by a psychologist, psychiatrist, or if it's physical, by an orthopedic surgeon. And if it's determined that that's the cause, they then are relieved of having to do their work, and they're covered financially. And either they get reassessed that they're better again and can return to work, and there's a stipulated period of time for that, or they're permanently disabled in some way, medically so, and they then are released through a series of insurance processes out of their work. But it's not an excuse for not performing to have a mental illness. You can't say, and this is, people should know this, you can't say, I'm sorry, you can't lower my bonus because I have a mental illness and that's why I can't work, so you must excuse me. There's no provision for that. A company is entitled to its maximum performance, and if any mental illness is in the way, the company is entitled to insist that the person be assessed if they put that forward as the reason for not performing.
Okay, let's talk about solutions now. So I believe I might have a form of anxiety or depression. What should I do? What are the steps?
So, specifically to the workplace, most good companies have what they call an employee assistance program. That means that they have an external psychological set of psychological services which are available for free initially to all staff. And what you should do is you should then contact the provider. It's totally confidential, and say, look, I think I'm having some difficulties. Can I have an assessment? They usually then, you see a psychologist, they assess you, and they provide a suggestion for treatment. Unfortunately, as I think you did say this earlier, a lot of people refuse,
yes,
or are in denial about their condition, and that's really where it becomes difficult.
When do you have to look at medication?
Okay, so depends on the condition. Some conditions are very receptive to just the talking cure, so to speak, and all the forms thereof, your therapies. And some conditions are very much based in what they call the organic level. So there's a hormonal or a brain-based chemical issue, and some actually the combination thereof. Now, research has shown that in the majority of mental illnesses, a combination of medication with therapy together gets your best prognosis. Some of your softer disorders, like your anxieties, a little bit of panic, your social anxiety, can be quite receptive to therapy, whereas your depressions, especially if they're quite deep, will often need an antidepressant to go along with it.
That's it for tonight. Thanks again for joining us. Please join us next week. We'll be talking to Dr. Elliot Chevel. He's the founder and director of Headache Clinic South Africa. In the meantime, keep healthy, and I'll see you here next week, I hope, for your weekly dose of health news.